Before we get started today, I would love to give a huge shout out to August patrons: Kate P., Jessica Y., Leslie S., Dana P., Yolanda from the Not Perfect or Functional podcast, Laura and Brooke from the Fall Line podcast, Esther from the Once Upon a Crime podcast, Mike from the Pleasing Terrors podcast, Kim from the Harry Potter Revisited podcast, Jillian from the Court Junkie podcast, and Lainey from the True Crime Fan Club podcast. Thank you so much for your donations. Welcome to Murder Road Trip. I'm your host, Haley. Joining me on today's road trip is Stephen Pappas. He is the co-host of two podcasts, Is This Adulting? And Meddling Kids. Stephen, can you tell us about both of your podcasts?
Sure, and thanks so much for having me. Is This Adulting is a podcast that focuses on breaking the stigma on mental illness through a comedic lens. We have on fun guests, we play games. You were a guest at one point, and it was awesome. And Meddling Kids is a week-by-week breakdown of the Scooby-Doo canon, starting with the first episode of Scooby-Doo and carrying on from there.
Thank you so much for telling us about both of your podcasts. I really enjoyed coming on Is This Adulting, and I appreciate you guys letting me come on. I would love to come on every week and be your third musketeer, but for some reason you won't let me come on. And who doesn't love Scooby-Doo? Where can listeners find you?
I'm just about everywhere on social media. You can find Is This Adulting on Facebook at facebook.com/isthisadulting. We're part of the Orbital Jigsaw Network, so you can find us at orbitaljigsaw.com. And you can find us on Twitter. I manage our Twitter handle at isthis_adulting. And then Meddling Kids is Meddling Kids Pod on Twitter, and just search for Meddling Kids on Facebook.
Thank you for being my road trip buddy. This week, we will be snacking on Cracker Jacks as we make our way to Chicago, Illinois to discuss part 1 of America's first serial killer, H.H. Holmes. When I have a co-host, I usually ask them what topic they would like to discuss. Stephen, what made you pick H.H. Holmes for today's trip?
I mean, it's H.H. Holmes. I know everybody's done H.H. Holmes, but I really wanted to talk about him because he's such a fascinating character, and he's America's first serial killer.
He really is fascinating.
Yeah, there's so much information out there, and I've listened to podcasts and read books, and I still am so interested every time I hear it. So, of course, I definitely wanted to do H.H. Holmes. And H.H. Gnomes, the H.H. Gnomes connection.
Yes. There really is so much information about H.H. Holmes out there, and all of our research is coming from Harold Schechter's book. I felt like if I tried to use 5 different sources, every source has different information because it took place so long ago. And so we're just going to use Harold Schechter's book because I love Harold Schechter, and I felt like he did a really good job.
I will say, if you're looking for a read on H.H. Holmes that's not Harold Schechter's book, because Harold Schechter is wonderful, I really like Eric Larson's Devil in the White City as well.
Oh yeah, are you looking forward to the movie?
I am. I'm a little nervous because sometimes those don't go well, but I mean, Scorsese and DiCaprio typically don't let me down, so hopefully it'll be good.
Right. All right, are you ready to go?
Let's do it.
We lost the station again.
Keep trying.
I'm safe.
Hold on. Let me try this one.
Stop. That's it. Turn it up. Turn it up. Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, to parents Levi and Theodate. He had an older brother, Arthur, a younger brother, Henry, and a younger sister, Mary. As a boy, Herman only had one friend, an older boy named Tom. Once, the two boys were exploring an abandoned house when Tom fell to his death from upstairs. By 11 years old, Herman had begun experimenting on animals. He started with salamanders and shortly thereafter worked his way to frogs, then rabbits, and from there rapidly progressed to cats and eventually dogs. Herman was able to disable animals without actually killing them, but regularly daydreamed about killing humans. At 16 years old, Herman graduated high school. He began teaching in Gilmanton and later in Alton. On July 4, 1878, Herman married his high school sweetheart Clara Lovering in Alton. Not long after, Clara fell pregnant, and on February 3, 1880, the couple welcomed a son whom they named Robert. At 18, Herman enrolled at the University of Vermont, but left after just a year. He went on to enroll in the University of Michigan in 1882 and studied in the Department of Medicine and Surgery. Around this time, his wife decided to leave Herman. She moved back to Vermont, taking their son Robert along with her. After graduating in June of 1884, Herman worked in an anatomy lab until he moved to Moores Forks, New York. A short time later, Herman moved once again, this time to Philadelphia, where he began working in a pharmacy. After accidentally killing someone with the wrong medication, Herman Webster Mudgett changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes. After the medication incident in Philadelphia, Holmes went to Baltimore, Maryland. This would be where he murdered his first victim, Dr. Robert Leacock. He had taken a life insurance policy out on the doctor, but after his death was unable to secure the money.
Next, H. Holmes moved yet again. This time he found himself in the Chicago suburb of Englewood, Illinois. While scouting for a place to make his daydreams of killing humans come true, Holmes found the perfect location, Dr. E. S. Holton's drugstore at Wallace and 63rd. In July of 1886, Holmes made a visit to the drugstore and had a chat with Mrs. Holton, the owner's wife. He explained that he was a graduate of the University of Michigan and was seeking employment. Mrs. Holton was grateful for the opportunity to have such an educated and knowledgeable talent walk into her drugstore looking for work, and she could certainly use the help. Due to the amount of traffic the drugstore received, her old age, and her husband's illness, Mrs. Holton was more than happy to hire Holmes on the spot. A short time after Holmes began working for the drugstore, the sickly Mr. Holton passed away. Holmes took over the books to help Mrs. Holton, and by late August, Holmes asked if he could purchase the store. Mrs. Holton said he could under one condition, that she could stay in the apartment upstairs. Holmes agreed, and the deed was signed after he gave her a down payment. Soon after the deed was signed, Holmes stopped making payments on the drugstore. Unsurprisingly, Mrs. Holton was not pleased by this and threatened to sue Holmes if he did not pay her. Not long after that, Mrs. Holton disappeared. When storegoers asked Holmes where she had gone, he would tell her that she had moved away to California because it was too difficult for her to remain in the same place her husband had passed away in. Holmes ended up moving into the apartment above the store.
In December of 1886, while on a business trip to Minneapolis, Holmes met Myrta Belknap. The two got married a very short time later, on January 28, 1887. Holmes then filed for divorce from Clara on February 14th, but when he didn't follow up on the filing, the case was dismissed.
Filed for divorce on Valentine's Day.
What a douche.
Yeah, he really was demented.
Myrta worked in the drugstore as a clerk for a short time, but when she started to cramp Holmes' flirtatious personality, he asked her to stay home and be a housewife. In the spring of 1888, just one short year after marrying Holmes, Myrta found herself pregnant. She began writing home about how unhappy she was with her new husband and their life together. Her sympathetic parents felt concerned for their daughter and wanted to help her in any way that they could, so they decided to move to the northern Chicago suburb of Wilmette and arranged for Myrta to move in with them. Shortly thereafter, Myrta welcomed her baby daughter into the world and named her Lucy. Holmes continued to provide Myrta and Lucy with financial support.
In the summer of 1888, Holmes wanted a bigger space. The apartment above the drugstore was just not big enough to accommodate the murder operations he had planned out for so long in all of his daydreams. He wanted to build something from scratch, so he could design and construct it exactly as he wanted. He ended up settling on a vacant lot across the street as a perfect site for his new creation. Holmes took over the lease for the lot and didn't waste any time hiring workers for the construction of his new building. Upon completion, the building would be 3 stories tall, with a cellar, and would take up the entire 50 by 162-foot lot of land that it was built upon. When the building was halfway completed, Holmes purchased a huge safe as a big walk-in vault on credit. He installed the safe in the 3rd floor of the building and then built a room around the safe with a door that was too small to remove the safe from. When the creditor company came to repossess the safe due to non-payment, Holmes said they could take it, but if they damaged the building in any way, he would sue them. Holmes bought many other large items on credit and installed them in the building. He installed a 3-foot-high, 3-foot-wide, 8-foot-long kiln that could reach 3,000 degrees. He also installed a zinc tank, several vats of acid and quicklime, and lined the walls with sheet iron plates.
The building was something of awe to the Englewood residents. They weren't shocked by how tall the building was, but by how much room the building took up and how many workers there were. Over the course of construction, Holmes would employ more than 500 workers. The high turnover rate for the employees was due to 2 reasons, both of which being very calculated and deliberate on Holmes's part. Firstly, it helped Holmes save money on wages. Most workers requested money after 2 weeks of work, but when the 2 weeks were over, Holmes would simply say that they did an unsatisfactory job. Then he would fire them and refuse to issue payment for the work they had done. Secondly, by hiring many different employees to each do a very small amount of work in only one specific section of the massive project, Holmes was able to hide the true layout of the building. One worker, Benjamin Peitzel, was not let go. Instead, he came to be one of Holmes's most trusted advisors. In total, the building took over a year and a half to complete. When it was finished in May of 1890, the building took up nearly half of Wallace Street.
The 1st floor was open to the public. It consisted of several shops. Some were run by Holmes, some were run by other owners. The 2nd floor was a maze. It had 6 dark corridors with 51 doors and 35 rooms that appeared to the average observer to be normal hotel bedrooms. However, in actuality, they were far from it. Some of the rooms were lined with steel plates and were airtight. Some were soundproofed. Others were so narrow and low-ceilinged that they looked like closets. Most of the rooms were rigged with gas pipes and peepholes and could only be locked from the outside. The 2nd floor was full of secret passageways, concealed sliding doors, panels, trapdoors, and greased shafts that led to the cellar. The 3rd floor housed Holmes's office and 3 dozen rooms. The hotel bedrooms were kept in narrow, angled hallways. Some of the hallways had unexpected turns, dead ends, stairs leading to nowhere, and randomly locked doors. The room adjacent to Holmes's office had a large safe, which was fitted with a gas pipe that could be turned on from his bedroom. There was also an 8-foot-tall, 3-foot-wide stove. The cellar was brick-walled and contained acid tanks, quicklime vats, a dissecting table, a surgeon's cabinet, and an elasticity determinator, which was a contraption that stretched people to twice their length. Englewood residents referred to the large building as the castle.
I just imagine the elasticity determinator to be the contraption that is used in The Princess Bride.
Yes.
That's exactly what I pictured it as.
That's kind of what, just like a stretching rack.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what I kind of pictured it as too, which is extremely disturbing.
Oh, that looked so painful in the movie. In June of 1890, Holmes put the drugstore up for sale. When he had a potential buyer come to town, Holmes paid people to come in and make fake purchases so it looked like the store was busy. After selling the store, Holmes promptly moved his pharmacy to the new building. The new owners were shocked and had to shut down shortly after opening. Holmes also opened a jewelry store, a restaurant, and barber shop in the new building. He was becoming obsessed with making as much money as possible, and that theme is going to continue. At some point, Holmes killed a castle tenant named Russell by bludgeoning him with a large chair when the man failed to pay his rent.
In November of 1890, Acilius, Ned, Connor, his wife Julia, and their daughter Pearl moved into the 3rd floor of Holmes's building after Ned took a job at the jewelry store. By March of 1891, Julia and Holmes were having an affair. Ned later found out about the affair and demanded that Julia leave Holmes or he would be leaving her. Julia refused to leave Holmes, so Ned moved into a downtown apartment and got a job at a different place. He kept trying to make the relationship with Julia work, but he eventually filed for divorce and left Chicago. In November of 1891, Julia told Holmes she was pregnant. She told him he needed to marry her. When Holmes said no, Julia blackmailed him by threatening to expose him for all the dirty business dealings she had learned of during her time there. Holmes ended up agreeing to marry Julia under one condition: she had to undergo an abortion. A month later, on Christmas Eve of 1891, Holmes poisoned Julia's daughter Pearl. Then he began the abortion on Julia. When the abortion was botched, he partially dissected her body. A few days later, Holmes contacted a man who could mount human skeletons, Charles Chappell. Holmes shipped Julia's body to Chappell in a steamer trunk. A week later, Chappell was able to sell the mounted skeleton to a medical college for $200, more than $5,000 in today's money. Holmes then received a cut for his part of the deal.
How creepy do you think it would be to know later on that you were at a medical college that had a mounted skeleton from like a person that didn't just die of natural causes?
Right. I can't imagine. I know in high school, like, there were skeletons in the anatomy classrooms and stuff, but they were plaster, and they freaked me out enough being plaster. So I can't imagine knowing that it was the skeleton of a real human, especially knowing the history of this one.
Right. At some point, Holmes traveled to Virginia on business. While there, Holmes met a man named Rogers. While fishing, Holmes found out the man had money, so he hit him with an oar until he was dead. During this time, Holmes also murdered 4 more people at the castle. He beat one man by the name of Charles Cole with a gas pipe. He also murdered a castle restaurant worker named Lizzie after finding out that the castle janitor, Pat Quinlan, had fallen in love with her. He feared the two would run off together, so he put her in his vault where she suffocated to death. When he was putting Lizzie's body in a steamer trunk, 2 tenants, pregnant Sarah Cook and her niece Mary Harricamp, walked in on him. He immediately put them in the vault where they quickly met their demise.
In April of 1892, Holmes's trusted worker, Benjamin Peitzel, came back from rehab and told Holmes about a beautiful woman he had met there. Holmes wrote to the woman, Emmeline Segrind, and offered her a job as a secretary. Emmeline arrived to the building in May, and the two were engaged by the fall. Their wedding was scheduled for the first week of December. Holmes asked Emmeline to address 12 envelopes for him so that he could send wedding announcements to her friends and family. During the first week of December, Holmes asked Emmeline to grab a document from the safe. When she entered the safe, Holmes shut and locked the door. No one knows how long it took for Emmeline to pass away from lack of oxygen, but the LaSalle Medical School had a new mounted skeleton a few weeks later. Soon after, Emmeline's friends and family would receive the wedding announcement she had written to them, letting them know that she'd just recently gotten married and would be very busy for the foreseeable future, so there was no need to be concerned if they didn't hear from her for a while.
After killing Emmeline, Holmes murdered several more people who worked or stayed at the castle. He poisoned a tenant named Rosine and buried her in the basement. He also murdered employee Robert Latimer after he tried to blackmail Holmes. Latimer was confined to a secret room and was starved to death. He killed the following people via asphyxiation, starvation, or poisoning: a young woman named Kate, as well as 2 men and a wealthy widow whose names I was unable to find in my research. Holmes also killed Anna Betts and Julia Connor's sister Gertie by giving them poison instead of using a prescription medication as he had done in the past. In addition to all of these poor souls, he also murdered a man named Warner by leading him into the kiln in the cellar and then delighting in the pleasure of hearing the man roasting to death.
In March of 1893, Holmes met 23-year-old Georgiana Yoke in a department store in Chicago. Also in March of 1893, Holmes met young property heiress Minnie Williams. She became Holmes's secretary, and the two were living together by May. Instead of staying in the castle, Holmes and Williams stayed in an apartment. When the creditors were getting close, Holmes persuaded Minnie to sign her property over to Holmes. The property was worth $40,000, or over $1 million in today's money. Holmes found out that Minnie was writing to her sister, Nanny, in May. Nanny was a threat to Holmes's plan to take over the property, so he told Minnie to invite her sister to town for a visit.
Also, in May of 1893, Chicago hosted the World's Fair in honor of the 400th anniversary since Christopher Columbus arrived in the country. An estimated 200,000 people attended the fair. No one is sure how many fairgoers Holmes killed, but his hotel was full every night for the fair's duration from May to October. He was able to gas residents and then send their bodies down the grease shaft, where the bodies would then land in a vat of acid. 50 World's Fair's attendees that stayed at Holmes' hotel were never seen again.
Minnie's sister Nanny arrived in June, and Holmes quickly charmed her. Within days, she was calling Holmes her brother. On July 3rd, 1893, Holmes took the two women to the fair. The next day, Holmes suggested that Nanny write to her uncle, who was also her caretaker, and tell him about the fun she was having. He also suggested that Nanny tell her uncle about their upcoming trip to Wisconsin, Maine, and New York. After she sent the letter off, Holmes offered to give Nanny a tour of the castle. She hadn't seen it yet. Holmes and Nanny left for the tour while Minnie stayed behind to clean the apartment. After the tour, Holmes told Nanny he needed to grab something from his safe. She went with him, and he locked her in the safe. Holmes headed back to the apartment and told Minnie he wanted to take her and Nanny out to dinner. They just needed to swing by the castle to pick up Nanny. Holmes poisoned Minnie and buried her in the cellar. With Minnie out of the picture, Holmes was able to begin dating the woman he had met at the department store in March, Georgiana Yoke. By the early fall, the two were engaged and had scheduled their wedding for December.
Meanwhile, the creditors were closing in on Holmes. He took out $25,000, or just over $600,000 in today's money, worth of insurance policies from 4 different companies. Then, Holmes and his janitor, Pat Quinlan, devised a plan to burn the castle down in order to claim the insurance money. In October, Quinlan lit the building on fire. The top floor was almost completely destroyed, the second floor received light damage, and the first floor remained undamaged. When Holmes tried to claim the insurance money, the companies told them they knew the fires were intentionally set. He would not receive any money.
Because the fire had not worked, Holmes moved on to the next con. He told Benjamin Peitzel that he was taking a life insurance policy out on him. He wanted to stage a huge accident, then Peitzel would go into hiding and a disfigured corpse would take his place. On November 9th, 1893, Holmes insured Peitzel for $10,000, roughly $250,000 in today's money, through Fidelity Mutual Life Association. At this time, the creditors who were after Holmes banded together and hired a lawyer. They confronted Holmes and told him he needed to immediately pay them $50,000, which is roughly $1.2 million in today's money, or they'd have the police put a warrant out for his arrest. November 22nd, 1893 was the last time anyone saw Holmes or Peitzel in Englewood.
It's pretty crazy to me that this is basically the only thing that people discuss when they talk about Holmes. Like, they talk about the castle, of course, because it's just so crazy to think about that a man constructed a murder castle. But what's going to happen in part 2 is so much more crazy and movie-like, but we never talk about it.
No, I feel like all of his insurance scams kind of fall by the wayside sometimes, and people focus so much on the castle, which is, I mean, if you really look at it, probably the reason that everyone considers him a serial killer, and he did kill more people at the castle than he would later in life. But the way his story kind of played out is just, like you said, it's very theatrical.
Yeah, I mean, it's very theatrical, and the castle is definitely very exciting, and I can't even imagine being a resident there and just thinking like, there's 51 doors, but only 35 rooms. Like, that just had to be so weird. And when I was reading the book, it just seemed like the construction of the castle was super shabby. And at first it looked really nice, but then as time went by, you could tell how poorly it was put together. But people were still in awe of this huge building.
Well, it was just all a front for this, like, crazy scheme. So I imagine he wouldn't have really cared. I mean, he would have cared that it looked nice at first, but I think at the end of the day, he was using it for one purpose, which was to kill.
Right.
And then if it started falling apart, I don't think he was planning on sticking around too long like we saw. But I can't imagine, with so many people coming through for the fair, what the number has to be. I know there's no sure number of how many people he killed, but it has to be over 100, right?
Yeah, they said that only that they know for sure that 50 people that stayed there were never seen again. But, maybe he didn't keep a good record. Maybe people didn't know that their family members were going to the World's Fair. 200,000 people went to the fair, and he was open and booked full for the entire months of May through October. So, I can only imagine how many people he took advantage of. And if you have a quick lime vat or acid vat in the basement, that just does a quick job of a body. There'd be no body left over for police to find.
Right. And it's so frustrating because I really want to know, just how many people did this monster kill?
Right.
But, we'll never know because it could have been 50 people total. It could have been, 400 people for all we know.
So I have a question for you.
Okay.
Do you think H.H. Holmes killed his childhood friend Tom when they were in that abandoned house?
Oh, 100%.
I think so too.
I completely believe that he accidentally fell over a banister, quote unquote. It's one of those situations where as soon as I heard that, I was like, that seems shady, especially
Right.
for someone who's fascinated by death and corpses. Because the reason, if I'm not mistaken, that he was so fascinated by corpses is because some bullies brought him in and showed him a dead body to scare him when he was a child. And rather than scaring him, he ended up becoming fascinated by death and by bodies.
That's a really good way to give an FU to your bullies.
Right, exactly. It's, oh, you thought this was going to scare me? Actually, I really like this. And it's crazy. From then on, he was obsessed with death and dead bodies. So I don't know if this was before or after that. But if it was after it, I 100% think that he probably killed his friend Tom. Which is sad. Poor Tom, just hanging out in an abandoned house with your bud.
And Tom was so much older. So it's hard to believe that the older one of the two would be the one to accidentally fall from the banister.
Right.
Do you have any final thoughts on part 1 of H.H. Holmes?
Not much. Just still sitting here thinking about just the gravity of how many people probably died at the hands of this single man. Still blows my mind.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for coming along for the ride, Stephen.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Until next time, please remember to check your back seats, and I'll see you at the next rest stop. Thank you to content editor Laura Taylor for making my research sound coherent. And thank you again to everyone who left a review for Murder Road Trip. If you didn't win this time, don't worry. There will be more contests in the near future. Dina, host of the Twisted Philly podcast, and I are coming together for a live show in suburban Philadelphia at the Center Theater on October 21st. The live show features Dina and I talking true crime, plus a Q&A hosted by Jeremy Collins of Podcasts We Listen To. Tickets to the show are limited, so make sure to get yours before they sell out. You can find a link to the event in the show notes. You can find Murder Road Trip at murderroadtrip.com, on Instagram and Twitter at MurderTrip, and on Facebook at MRT Podcast. If you're interested in continuing the discussion, you can join the Murder Road Trip podcast group on Facebook. Make sure to check out the Murder Road Trip playlist on Spotify. You can even add songs to the playlist. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe on your podcast app of choice. If you'd like to listen to the episodes before everyone else, listen to bonus content, and get exclusive merchandise, you can check out Murder Road Trip on Patreon. Please stay tuned after the music to hear from Steven's podcast.
Hey everybody, this is your best friend Steven,
And this is your best friend, Chris.
and we're the hosts of the podcast Is This Adulting?
Every week, we sit down to talk about life, debate pointless topics, and most importantly, break the stigma on mental illness through opening up about our own struggles and how it affects us every day. Oh, and do you like games? We got those too.
What about guests from all your favorite podcasts?
Ooh, like Justin from Generation Y, or Nina from Already Gone, or Hal Lublin from Everything. And of course, you can't forget our special guest, Tom Bodette from those Motel 6 commercials. Okay, that last one might have been a stretch.
Yeah, just like them. So, join us each Thursday as we attempt to navigate adulthood as overgrown man-children. And remember, kids, be happy, stay healthy, and go hug someone.
Because you never know. They might just be the host of your new favorite podcast.
Hey everybody, I'm Stephen Pappas.
And I'm Julie Ken.
And we are the host of the Meddling Kids podcast, a review of all things Scooby-Doo.
We are going through every episode in the Scooby-Doo canon to explain all the questions you meddling kids have.
Right, exactly. Like, is Fred a serial killer? How old is Fred exactly?
Why does Daphne have such bad posture?
Where do these kids live? And is pot legal there?
Where is this place? I think it's Florida. Anyway, stick with us for the Meddling Kids podcast, a groovy review of all things Scooby-Doo.